Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest Asian Carp Canada webinar. My name is Rebecca Schroeder, and I work on the Asian Carp project at the Invasive Species Center. So this afternoon, we are joined by John Navarro, who will be speaking to us about the status of grass carp in Ohio and how they're responding to this issue. John is the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Administrator for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. John is the Aquatic Invasive Species Program Administrator for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, and he also chairs the Grass Carp Ad Hoc Committee. So following the webinar, we'll have time for John to answer some questions. So if you have any, as we go along, you can type them in the question box, and he'll do his best to answer as many of them as possible with the time we have remaining. So thanks again for listening, and I'll let John take over from here.
Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thanks to the Invasive Species Center for setting this webinar up. This is the first time I've ever done a webinar from this end, so it's kind of cool, and I have my shoes off, I'm in my socks, I'm comfortable, and I don't have anybody looking at me, so I kind of like it. It's really good timing for this talk because grass carp has been in the news quite a bit lately, and there appears to be quite a bit of misinformation out there concerning grass carp. So this is a really good time to hopefully get everybody up to speed with where things are with grass carp in North America. So Ohio is relatively new to the Asian carp game. Things really ramped up in 2012 when we first observed bighead carp and silver carp in the Ohio River around Cincinnati. These are the two that we're really concerned about, and I'll explain this later. But that really ramped up our attention with respect to Asian carp. And so it's been a busy 4 years. A lot has happened. So first off, I want to kind of go over a quote that was in a newspaper. I won't go into the paper or the person giving the quote, but it says, Asian carp reproducing in Sandusky River and still nothing done. So when that showed up, it was a little disconcerting because, first of all, and as I'll explain in a minute, Asian carp refers to several species of Asian carp, as I'll explain, including grass carp. So it really is grass carp are reproducing in the Sandusky River, and the quote that nothing is being done is a little, in my mind, a little bit insulting because, as I'll show you, a lot is being done with respect to grass carp. So here's the outline of my presentation. I want to give a little bit of background information to get everybody up to speed. I want to talk about things that we've already been doing, things that we hope will get done, and then future actions that we're planning. So starting with background information, like I said, the term grass or Asian carp refers to mainly 4 different species of fish, the silverhead, bighead, the black carp, and the grass carp. So when people use the term Asian carp, it's a little confusing because they really should be using one of the species names, because even though these things are all Asian carp, they're really very different with many respects. So it's really important to differentiate that. Silver carp and bighead carp feed at the lower end of the food chain. They're planktivores, so they're swimming around, taking in phytoplankton, zooplankton, and that's how they feed. Grass carp, on the other end, they are actually eating aquatic vegetation. So they're rooting along the bottom, eating plants. And then black carp, on the other hand, they're molluscivores. So they're eating snails and mussels. So each of these are, yes, they're Asian carp, but they're actually very different in how they act, what they feed on, and what their impact on native species would be. So why are Asian carp here? Basically, they were brought over for a reason, and the reason are they are very good as biological controls for different things that people don't want. So these things were brought over intentionally. Silver carp and big head carp are basically swimming vacuum cleaners, and they were brought over for use in southern aquaculture for keeping catfish ponds clean. Basically, these things are swimming around, keeping it clean, and that helps with water quality and other issues they were having. Black carp, on the other hand, were brought over to take care of snails, mainly because they're a vector for some disease issues in southern aquaculture. So those are an effective tool for keeping those populations down and helping with disease issues. And then grass carp are kind of a different critter because those are popular mostly with pond owners that are trying to control aquatic vegetation when it gets too out of hand. So they were brought over kind of during a time when chemical control was kind of wasn't looked at in a good light. People wanted to get away from constantly using chemicals for controlling these issues. They're also very cost effective. You put a few grass carp in a pond and you have effective vegetation control for quite a while as opposed to having to constantly use chemicals. And everything would be fine and we wouldn't be having this call today if these things would have stayed where they were put. But unfortunately, we do have all four of these species out and reproducing in various locations in the U.S. When it comes to regulations, it's kind of a patchwork when you look at who's doing what. If you look at some of the northern states and Canadian provinces, they don't allow any grass carp. They're prohibited. So that's the most protective control you can have, is not allowing them. The next level of control would be triploids, which triploids are the same as sterile, which means they can't reproduce. So the idea is if they did get out, yes, they would be out, but impacts would be minimal and they wouldn't be able to reproduce and start populations in the wild. And that's where a lot of the states are triploid states, including Ohio. We feel that grass carp are a very effective tool that people can use, and we feel that using triploids is the responsible thing to do. And then you have states that are still allowing fertile fish, fertile grass carp to be used, and that's just a handful of states, and you can see a couple of them there in green. And obviously that's the least effective for prohibiting them from getting out and reproducing. We are, and I'll mention this later, we are hopeful that we can get everybody at least to a triploid state, because I think that would get us pretty far in addressing this problem. So a little bit of a history on grass carp in Lake Erie. They started being imported in 1963. Like I said, they're used for vegetation control, mainly by private landowners. Like I said, they are an effective control on vegetation, and it keeps you from having to use mechanical or chemical means. And a lot of the states switched to sterile fish, or what are called triploids, in 1983. And that was over concern about these things getting out and reproducing. So a lot of people switched to the triploid fish in the early 80s. And it's important to note that if you look at when we started using grass carp and when we switched to sterile fish, that's a 20-year period where fertile fish were being stocked and potentially getting out and reproducing. So that's a 20-year gap. That's a pretty big window on when things could have been happening a while back. We started seeing grass carp, at least in Ohio, in the 1980s. When we were, we'd get reports of grass carp, or we'd collect them when we were out sampling. But we always thought these were triploid or sterile fish that had been stocked and gotten out, and we really didn't think it was that big an issue. It wasn't until, at least for Ohio and some other states, when big head and silver carp started making it up towards our borders, that it really got us to start thinking about grass carp and looking at those things a little bit harder. So we first started seeing fertile grass carp in 2012. Like I said, when bighead and silver showed up in the Ohio River around Cincinnati, it was all hands on deck, and we started looking closer at grass carp, started collecting wild grass carp when we came across them, and started testing them for ploidy, you're either diploid or triploid when you test for ploidy. And what we found out is that 90% of the wild captures were actually fertile fish, and this was very alarming. We didn't think we'd be finding that many fertile fish in the wild. We thought we'd be seeing a lot more of the sterile triploids. We also have collected multiple size classes of grass carp, which means that they have been reproducing, at least on occasion. Reproduction has been noted in the Sandusky River, which I'll go into in more detail, but to date the numbers are very low, so we really haven't seen any impacts from grass carp being out there. So what do we know? We do know that there's been successful development of eggs in the Sandusky River. The University of Toledo and USGS have been doing studies for a couple years, and are going to continue to do studies where they are collecting eggs that are in the wild, and they have been able to determine that these eggs are viable. But the egg densities have been very low when compared to other eggs they're coming across. It's we're talking a handful of eggs when compared to the thousands of eggs that you're going to run across. And to date, we haven't been able to find any larval fish, although we will keep looking for them. So yes, there's eggs. Yes, they're developing. Developing eggs does not equal recruitment. The fact that we're not seeing larval fish is encouraging, but we're going to still be out there looking pretty hard this year and in the future. So what USGS and the University of Toledo are able to do through modeling is they can, when they find an egg and determine how far it is into its development, they can look at stream flows and all other kinds of parameters and determine a general location on where that egg came from, which equals where these things are spawning. And that's a really important point, which I'll bring up in a minute. And they also noticed that high flows in the spring seem to be the trigger that brings the grass carp up into the rivers to spawn from the main lake or bays. So those are two really important points on trying to find out where these things are congregating. So I'm going to go into our current actions that we've been doing for a while now. Instead of, as the quote said, doing nothing, we've been doing quite a bit on this. And it kind of breaks down, at least for Ohio, into four categories: outreach, getting information out to the public; regulations, trying to prevent their expansion; research, like I mentioned, a lot of groups are out there doing really good research that's going to help us; and actions, which I'll talk about at the end of the presentation on what we're actually going to be doing. So we've started a campaign called Trash Unused Bait. And what we're thinking here is that if someone collects their own bait, or they get bait from a bait store, most people aren't top-notch taxonomists, so there could be an invasive species in your bait bucket, and you might not know it. So you could go fishing. At the end of the day, you have stuff left over, and the common practice is just to dump them into the lake you're fishing. And we're trying to keep people from doing that, because that could be an easy way to spread invasive species. So we have billboards, print ads, posters, trying to get people to, when they're done at the end of the day, take your bait with you and throw it in the trash. We also recently implemented a regulation and administrative code where we were concerned about people collecting their own bait and then taking and using it in another location. So common practice is to collect fish in the tailwaters or below dams where they're easy to collect. And then you take those fish and you go up into the reservoir and use them. And like I said, the concern is use of bait isn't a big concern. Usually when you put it on a hook and you use it as bait, it's not gonna survive. But the ones in the bucket that could get dumped out at the end of the day are the ones we're concerned about. So we have a regulation that if you collect bait, you gotta use it in the water body that you collected it from, which is to reduce, prevent these things from expanding their range. We also, there's a very, very active trade in live fish. They're very popular with certain cultures. They prefer to have live fish when they buy them to eat, which is fine, but we feel that that's a vector or a pathway that these things could get into the wild. So in Ohio, anything that we consider invasive on our prohibited list, you're not allowed to have them alive. But there seems to be some problems with people in how you define dead. It might sound pretty simple, but there was a case where someone was hauling, it was either silver or bighead carp from the U.S. into Canada. When they got to the border, they were on ice, but the Canadian border folks are pretty sharp, and they saw that some of the fish were moving. When they put them on water, they came right back and were swimming around. So turns out what these people did was they had live fish, live Asian carp. When they got close to the border, they took the water out of the tanks, dumped some ice on them, hoping to get through the inspection, and then when they get past the border, get water back on them. And lo and behold, then you have live bighead or silver carp, which are worth much more on the market than dead fish. So they're trying to get around it, but luckily it didn't work, and hands down to the Canadian Border Patrol for catching them. So in Ohio, we made it very clear. Some people, they're not sure what dead is. In Ohio, this would not be dead. So we had to come up with actual definitions that ensure that fish that are considered injurious or invasive in Ohio are truly dead. So if you have any of the bighead silvers, black, or grass carp, at least diploid grass carp or the fertile grass carp in Ohio, they have to be eviscerated, which means you've taken the organs out, the head removed, or this is mainly for researchers. They have to be preserved in ethanol or alcohol. And we're pretty sure that if they're in one of these three states that they truly are dead, and helps eliminate this as a pathway for them getting into the wild. We also, like I said, we're concerned about the bait trade. Not that people will be doing this intentionally, but a lot of people are not top-notch taxonomists, and a lot of these things, when they're younger, they look alike, like the silver carp, juvenile silver carp in the top, and the gizzard shad on the bottom. Grass carp also, when they're younger, look like some of the fish that might be used for bait. And when you're looking into a bait bucket, I would dare anybody to be able to differentiate between some of these. So we've had to do a lot of education and inspections of our bait industry. So what we've been doing is our law enforcement section has been, here, let me go to the next slide. Like I said, bait stores anymore are not just bait stores. A lot of them are selling other stuff, like you can see in this picture. And so the people at the counter, they're probably not going to know how to identify their fish. So we've been sending our law enforcement group around, and we've been going to all the bait shops, which there are over 500 in Ohio, and we've been inspecting them and trying to, along with making sure that they're not breaking any laws, making sure that they know what to look for with respect to invasive species. So we visited all our bait stores, and we are going to be visiting all of them in a rotation over time. One of the cool tools we have, and I wasn't able to get the video up, is we use GoPro cameras to put those in the bait tanks, because one of the techniques you do for checking bait is to just scoop out fish on several scoops, trying to look for stuff. But we found these GoPros are pretty effective at identifying invasive species, and it's really interesting because fish tend to segregate. So some of the things that shouldn't be there tend to be away from the other ones that should be there. And sometimes it's pretty easy to pick out stuff that shouldn't be in the tanks. So that's been an effective tool. And to date, we haven't found any high-risk invasive species in our bait inspections. One other thing we did is we didn't want this to be heavy-handed and all regulatory. We want to work cooperatively with the bait industry. So what we've done is we put together this quick ID features guide for bait fish, and it's available on our website, the ODNR, Ohio DNR website, and it's a really neat guide for how some of the invasives look very much like the native fish that are used in bait. So we feel that this is a good tool for the bait stores. We made them, they're high quality, waterproof, so they can be used and not destroyed. And hopefully these people, if they see something they think is weird, that they'll be able to ID it and get a hold of us and let us know what's going on. So this dealer edition is going to be revamped into a public version that should be going out within the next year. So that's how we're dealing with bait. Another concern we had is because you can get more money for a sterile triploid because it costs money to make them. So you can make more money on a sterile fish than a fertile fish or a diploid. We were concerned about what we were calling laundering of fertile grass carp under the guise that they were sterile. Because if you look at a grass carp, you can't tell. It's not something you can see. You have to use a specific test to determine ploidy or if it's diploid or triploid. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a grass carp certification program, and the Mississippi River Basin Panel on Aquatic Invasive Species did a really good study on that whole program, and they came out feeling pretty good that fish leaving a certified facility are 100% triploid. So we're not concerned about the facilities that are raising triploids. We think they're doing a good job. We think the Fish and Wildlife Service has really good checks and balances to make sure those things are truly triploid when they leave the facility. But like I said, we were concerned about laundering of fish because once they leave the facility, anything can happen. You can take a hauling truck and go over to another facility and throw in diploids, and you pretty much be good to go. It'd be hard to determine that you were actually breaking the law, at least in many states, by bringing diploid fish in. So we actually did a 2-year undercover operation in Ohio where our law enforcement guys dressed up in Carhartts and John Deere hats and went to all these places that sell grass carp. A lot of times it's a truck that shows up in a parking lot at a Tractor Supply, or a lot of times the district soil and water conservation groups will have grass carp sales where a truck pulls up, you go up with a bag just like you would when you're buying a fish in a aquarium store, and then you buy them and you take them and you put them in your pond. And we don't have a problem with that. We just wanted to make sure that everything that was being sold were truly sterile fish. And after we did the 2-year study, buying 600 fish randomly, we didn't find any diploid fish. So at least over that 2-year period, and I did mention it was undercover. We weren't showing up and we weren't highly identifiable. We feel pretty confident that people are following the rules. So we're pretty happy with this program. It would have been disconcerting if we were finding a lot of diploids in these shipments. So that's a lot of the stuff we're doing with respect to making sure that the supply chain, the bait industry are all not adding fish to the problem that we have. So the next big thing we're doing is trying to address knowledge gaps when it comes to grass carp. So like I said, we're going to continue to monitor the ploidy of fish we catch in the wild, trying to see what the type of fish are out there. You can do tests on the hard structures of fish, the bony structures, and you can determine natal origin or where these fish came from through some pretty sophisticated testing. And that's a really good tool for figuring out fish that we're catching, where they actually came from. Did they come from the Sandusky River? Did they most likely come from a commercial operation in Arkansas? All that stuff we can figure out using that. It turns out that commercial fishermen are pretty damn good at catching these fish. It's their livelihood. They don't really have room for inefficiency. So these guys, it's their business. So they've been very effective and very cooperative. And when they catch grass carp, letting us have them and letting us test them. So they are a partner in this whole thing. And they might be playing a bigger role in the future when we start looking at control activities. Eggs and larvae, we're going to continue to look for them in the Sandusky River and most likely expand into some other potential rivers in the future, looking for eggs and larvae. The next one is telemetry. We have been putting transmitters in grass carp and releasing them. I know it's been controversial and it's been a really tough decision, but we feel that what we gain by having these fish out there and us knowing where they're going is invaluable and a really important part of trying to figure out these fish and where they're going. So we have over 30 fish out there, and this has been done through Michigan DNR and Michigan State University. And so they have fish out there. There's a system out there that can detect these things when they go past a receiver. These things are all over the Great Lakes. They're used for other studies. You can put transmitters in walleye and other fish, and they'll be picked up by these same receivers. So we're taking advantage of this array that's out there and looking at where these things are moving. And I can't express more how important this information is as we move forward with dealing with these things. Like I said, UT, University of Toledo, and USGS will continue to model the Sandusky River, and I'll explain why that's so important, because we're going to use that information in the future, trying to figure out where these things are congregating when they go up and spawn. Population genomics, that's looking at the genetics of these fish. You can learn a lot by using genetics to study these things, and I'm not a geneticist, so I'm not going to go into the details, but just believe me that this is really cutting edge science that's really important. And finally, we're also looking at where the vegetation is in the lakes, because these things feed on vegetation. So if you find the vegetation, it's most likely going to be where these things are going to show up. And we can also monitor impacts of these things if they do increase in population size, to see if they are impacting vegetation out there. So that goes against the thing that we're doing nothing. We are doing a lot. So hopefully that's sinking in to certain people. Desired outcomes. So there's been a lot of discussion on where we are on the invasion curve when it comes to grass carp. And there's four stages for in the invasion curve, and it's arrival, survival, establishment, and spread. So when it comes to grass carp, pretty obvious they've arrived. So you can check that one. Obviously, they're surviving. We're catching adults, and so obviously they're going to be able to survive, at least in Lake Erie, just because it's shallow and fertile, and probably of all the Great Lakes, probably the one they'll like the most. Establishment. This is where we start getting into the questionable area on, are these things established? And that's something we need more data to figure out if these things actually are established. And then finally, are they spreading to other locations? And these two are really important to nail down to determine where we are on this invasion curve. So for the guys out there, you can see that whoever planned this restroom did not put a lot of planning into it, and I'll just leave it at that. And when it comes to Asian carp, when they showed up in 2012, we were really, to be honest, we were running around doing silly stuff that really wasn't going to move the ball forward, but we felt we needed to do something, so we did anything, and it really wasn't very effective. So it really pushed us into a lot of planning, and planning's not fun, but I tell you, it's really critical as you move forward and you have people that are asking you what you're doing or questioning things. If you can point to a plan that's really solid and you can tell them, this is what we're doing, it really puts you in a really good spot. And we have 4 plans in Ohio. The state management plan, which is our overarching AIS plan, all the states have it, and it's basically their overarching planning document. We also developed a rapid response plan as part of the state management plan. And the idea of this is if you have an invasive show up in a location where you can actually do something quickly to keep it from getting established, then this is where we'd implement the rapid response plan. The next plan we have is we actually have an Asian carp specific tactical plan. For Ohio, it's split into the 2 watersheds. We have the Ohio River watershed, where we have all 4 of these species of our Asian carp. And then we have the Lake Erie watershed, which has grass carp, obviously, but does not have the big head silvers and black. So we're treating these 2 watersheds differently because we think we should be paying most of the attention to where they're not as opposed to where they're at. Once you get something established like they are in the Ohio River, it's really very hard to control them and try to eradicate them. I can honestly say it's nearly impossible once an invasive gets established to get rid of it. And then we have the Asian carp response guidelines, which is based on a risk-return scenario where the risk is the system that you're dealing with. So the Ohio River we would consider a low risk for Asian carp just because they're all there, whereas Lake Erie we consider that a high risk system. So if they show up in Lake Erie, obviously like I'm explaining today with grass carp, this is getting our attention and we are working on this species. And then you got to look at the return, which is the likelihood that if you went out there and did something that you'd actually be effective. Running around Lake Erie with electrofishing boats with no information is basically a waste of resources. You really need to be more effective in how you go after these things so that you get a return on your action, because we don't have an endless pot of money to work from. So we got to be very, very cost effective, which is why we're doing all the work we're doing with grass carp, trying to figure these things out. Michigan DNR and Michigan State University had a structured decision-making workshop a while back. And basically, I'm not going to go into the details. It's pretty complicated. It was a 2-day meeting, so it's a lot to learn. But basically, it's a way to find solutions to complicated issues. And grass carp is obviously a complicated issue if you didn't know already. So Michigan DNR and Michigan State are in the middle of, we had a workshop, and they're going to be developing actions from that, the information they took on the best way to move forward when it comes to grass carp. So we're not alone in this situation. Ohio is not working within Ohio. We're working with our partners. I've gotten to know a lot of people a lot better over the last 4 years just because I go to a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions, and a lot of cooperation, which is really good. A lot of good people out there, smart people working on this stuff. The first one is the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee. That's the group that's working on Asian carp. And they have incorporated grass carp as one of the species they're going to work on. But I want to stress that we don't want to take away from all the work that's being done on bighead and silver carp, just because we think the impact of those species in Lake Erie and the other Great Lakes is going to be significantly higher than grass carp if they were able to become established. So we want to keep our focus on the bighead and silver, but we also are going to devote a lot of resources to this grass carp issue. There's a lot of groups, a lot of acronyms there that worked on the binational risk assessment. That was a Canada-U.S. joint effort. That report should be coming out soon. And I know Becky Cudmore will be on the call at the end of my presentation at least, and she should be able to answer any questions on where we are with the risk assessment. The Council of Great Lakes Fisheries Agencies, which are all the Great Lakes states and Canadian provinces, have been working on, they actually started an invasive fish executive committee to help guide all of us in how we move forward with all invasives, including Asian carp. Like I mentioned, Mississippi River Basin Panel, there's actually 6 panels in the U.S. that work on invasive species issues, and they work under the umbrella of the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, which is the federal group. So we all work under that umbrella. Ohio is a member of the Mississippi River Basin Panel and the Great Lakes Panel. The Mississippi River Basin Panel has been working really hard on figuring out the supply chain for grass carp, and we're going to be working on trying to convince the states that are still using fertile fish to switch to triploids, because we just think that would help. So they've been a real good partner, and just recently the Great Lakes Panel started a grass carp ad hoc committee, so we're getting everybody together and dealing with grass carp issues. I'm actually the chair of that meeting, and things have been going really good, a lot of good discussion, and it's all of this is trying to move the needle forward with how we're working with Asian carp and all invasive species, to be honest with you. So the objectives as we move forward for working on grass carp is trying to test these capture methodologies, and probably the biggest name in the game is the Illinois DNR, which is dealing with bighead silver, mainly in the Illinois River, which is the connection to Lake Michigan. I'm sure everybody's heard about the electric barrier in Chicago at the Chicago Area Waterway. That's a direct connection between the two watersheds. The electric barrier is in place to try to keep things from moving back and forth. But Kevin's done a really good job, and all his people, on trying to keep that, what we're calling the leading edge in the Illinois River, from getting to the electric barrier. And the idea is if you can keep those densities low, the transfer risk is greatly reduced. So Kevin and his group are probably the best group when it comes to figuring out how to capture Asian carp. And I know I said these things are different, but in a lot of ways they're very similar. And the things we're learning in bighead and silver can be transferred to grass carp, and vice versa. The stuff we're learning on grass carp can be used to learn stuff about bighead and silver. So we'll probably be leaning on Kevin pretty heavily as we move forward with trying to do control actions in the Sandusky River. We're going to be moving ahead with actions we've been doing, trying to validate a lot of the information. Like I said, we'll hope to use information learned from grass carp to do actions on bighead silver and black carp as that risk gets closer. One of the things we're hoping for is trying to find that silver bullet, which we still haven't found yet, for how we can control individual species of fish. It's pretty complicated because it's got to be targeted. You can't put something out there that kills everything. The best example is sea lamprey control. We're able to control that population at an acceptable level by going after those things in the larval stage in stream headwaters. They do burrow in the sediment, and you can be pretty effective on controlling those at that location. Maybe we can find something for Asian carp. We haven't found it yet, but we're still hoping. Obviously, trying to develop response capabilities for bighead silver and grass carp and black carp as those things get closer. Obviously, because we're getting quotes about not doing anything, we need to be better at communicating what's going on, and I think we've been really aggressive lately in trying to get together the main talking points for grass carp. So we can get that out to people and let them know we are doing stuff, we do care, and we think this is the responsible way to move forward. And obviously information sharing, like I said, we've gotten to know each other very well over the past 4 years, and we'll probably get to know each other even better as we move forward. So probably the biggest thing we're getting knocked for is people are, why aren't you out there getting these things and eradicating them? And it's pretty easy to say that. It's more difficult to put it into action. So in 2014, Ohio DNR and Michigan DNR did a grass carp response exercise where we brought, you can see everybody in that picture there. We had numerous states, we had Canadian provinces, federal agencies, just about anybody that was interested. We had them in for an exercise in 2014 where we were trying to capture grass carp. Oh, sorry, I didn't forward the slide. Yep, there's and on the guy in the boat circled in red there. So I did participate. It was a great exercise. A lot of people, as you can see in this picture, a lot of logos up there. But we wanted to try to see if we could go out with the capture technologies that we had, using some of the information that we gathered, using some detection techniques we had at the time that I'm not going to go into it because that would be a whole different 20-minute presentation. But we tried to use information we had to direct ourselves towards getting grass carp in 2014. So this is where we did our activities. It was all in Michigan waters of Lake Erie. And these are all the locations that we went to because this is where we suspected we'd find them based on the information we had. So a lot of efforts, I think it was over 3 to 4 days. And since, yeah, it was over 3 days in 2014. We had, as you can see here, we spent a lot of time electrofishing, a lot of gill net time out there. We had commercial fishermen out there. So over 3 days, all this intensive work, we collected 2 grass carp, and 2 others were observed but not collected. So I guess the moral of the story here is that's a lot of work for 2 fish collected and a total of 4 observed. So obviously, we can't be doing that kind of effort with that kind of return. We need to get better at this stuff. So that's what we're working on in the future. So this is how we're moving forward with our control efforts. Is we need to increase our knowledge on grass carp. We still don't know these things inside and out. There's still a lot to learn. So what we need to do as we move forward with control technologies is we need to figure out what habitats they like, where they're moving, Most importantly, we want to find out where these things are spawning, and not just that they're in the Sandusky River, but we want to know specifically where they are in the Sandusky River, because we think that can go a long way towards trying to control these things, because you're much more effective if you can find these things grouping up as opposed to when they're spread out. And then, like I mentioned, and we'll be working with our partners to try to refine our capture techniques so that if they are there, we're pretty sure that we're effective in catching these things. So here's what we have for the future. We are going to be going into the Sandusky River with traditional gear, trying to catch these things, using information that we've gathered so far and more information that will be gathered, trying to find out where these things are going to be at. Most likely it's going to, obviously it's going to be in the spring when they're spawning, and it's probably going to be related to a high water event, which seems to trigger grass carp moving up the rivers to spawn. So in 2017, we're going to do an action where we're going to be out there refining our techniques and trying to get better and seeing if we can catch these things in the locations where we think they're at, with the idea that we'll gain more knowledge. And the idea is in 2018, we want to do a much bigger effort in the Sandusky River with much more people to try to see if we can catch these things and eradicate them. So, and the idea is not to have 80 people out there or 100 people out there over 3 days. We're thinking it'd probably be better, smaller groups over a longer period of time. We think that'd be more effective in trying to figure out where these things are and trying to get rid of them. A one-shot deal is probably not most effective. We think several smaller efforts combined would be probably the best way to move forward. So that's where we're thinking on going in 2017 and 2018 for our control efforts. As I finish up, I want to tell you what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. So we are going to continue to gather information and try to gain knowledge about these things, because knowledge is power, and that's going to allow us to be more effective in dealing with these things. And we will do control efforts on grass carp as the science dictates where we should be doing it. So instead of running around trying to find things in Lake Erie, which is a pretty big body of water, we're going to be in specific locations and river systems where we think our return's going to be very high. We're not going to run around aimlessly looking for grass carp. We just, that's irresponsible. It's not good use of the funding that's available. Like I said, it's a finite use of money, and we got to be very effective in how it's used. So I want to end with the quote from the beginning, except I did a little bit of editing on this quote. So the red markouts are what I removed, and the black text is what I added. So it needs to be very, very clear that we are dealing with grass carp in the Sandusky River in Lake Erie, not Asian carp. Like I said, we don't have big head and silvers. Those are two very scary species that aren't there yet, and they shouldn't be lumped in as Asian carp. We should be calling them out for what they are, which are grass carp. And the other thing is still doing nothing, or still nothing done. I've removed that and added that we're doing a unified, that there's a unified effort underway to address the problem. So with that being said, that's my daughter. She loves being in the outdoors. We need to think about the future, because I'm 55 and this problem is going to be going on long past when I'm past. So we got to think about future generations and how we deal with this, because the future generations are going to be the ones holding the bag if we don't deal with this effectively. So that I'm done. Sorry it went for 53 minutes or 50 minutes, but I'll take questions now.
That was great, very informative for sure. So now we do have time for some questions, and as you mentioned earlier, Becky Cudmore from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada will be on the line if there's any Canadian-specific questions. I don't think she's here yet, but she should be.
Yeah, I'm on.
Oh, she's here. It worked. Okay, so the first question that we have is, considering most of the Asian carps caught in Canadian waters, example in the St. Lawrence in 2016, were triploids, could these be American introductions that traveled here?
I guess Becky and I can both answer it. It could be both. I can't speak for Canada and how long they've had their prohibition in place. If they've never allowed grass carp, it's most likely these things are coming from the U.S. side.
Yeah, that's right. We haven't had any usage of grass carp in aquaculture on the Ontario side. And the fish that we have captured with the data that we have to date, they did come and were born in aquaculture facilities.
Okay, the next question is, the regulations that you spoke about today to prevent bait movement are similar to the regulations put in place to prevent the spread of VHS. Are these efforts you mentioned today new and specifically related to grass carp, or have they been in place since VHS was discovered in the Great Lakes?
No, well, I can answer that. The regulations we put in place that I showed are new. Those are relatively new. I think they were put in place in 2014. What the whole intention is to reduce the movement of invasive fish from one body of water to the other. VHS is a whole different animal. That's a virus, obviously, and the whole idea for that was to, we have VHS in Lake Erie. We don't have it in the Ohio River watershed. So the idea on bait movement there was to keep things from coming the other direction. I'm pretty sure I have that right. But the rule that I showed was specifically for fish and driven by Asian carp.
All right. And the next question is, are there any receivers along the Sandusky River to help with migration monitoring?
I don't have that information, but yes, there are receivers in the Sandusky River, the Maumee River, and most of our major tributaries, and these were mostly put in place, and I don't know if Becky can chime in on this, but mostly put in place to monitor for sport fish, mainly walleye. We're just piggybacking on the system and using it to detect movement of grass carp. So they are in the Sandusky River. The monitors are in the Sandusky River and the Maumee River because those are our two main tributaries for walleye spawning. So we needed those in there to see movement of walleye for spawning, but we're also taking advantage of them for grass carp movements.
Okay, and then also, someone missed what the acronym CGLFA stood for and was wondering what it stood for.
That's the Council for Great Lakes Fisheries Agencies, I believe.
Okay. Another question was, the fish that were used in the telemetry work, were they diploid or triploid? And do triploid fish behave differently than diploid do? Examples, do triploids try to reproduce?
Well, I can answer that. Anything we're catching, we're putting back out with a transmitter in it. So both diploids and triploids. The answer to your second question is I don't know. That's an excellent question, that if something is sterile, does it behave the same as something that is fertile? And that was one of the big dilemmas we had with people that were in shock that we were releasing a fertile fish back into the system. But if we just tagged sterile fish and put them out, we have no idea if they're going to act the same as a fertile fish that's actually going through the whole spawning routine. So to be honest with you, it was really important for us to have tagged fertile fish out there because we just don't know if they act differently.
All right, we have a few more questions still. So the next one is, do you think that the closing of the Chicago Sanitary and Shipping Canal is a possible and or realistic method for stopping the invasion of the Great Lakes?
That's a loaded question. That one's really complicated because the Chicago area waterway has a lot of uses. Transfer stormwater, wastewater is discharged into there. It's also an important for shipping. It's a big shipping area. That's why it's called the Sanitary and Shipping Canal. So pouring a bunch of cement in there and blocking it off is problematic in that it affects a lot of things in the system. It's not as simple as pulling up 100 cement trucks and cutting it off. With that being said, there's groups out there that are trying to work on a permanent solution for the Chicago area waterway with the knowledge that we don't feel that the electric barrier is 100% effective, but a very important tool as we move towards a more permanent solution.
Okay, and I think this next question is better suited for Becky.
I've been talking too much.
Are there any actions being considered on the Ontario side for 2017 after the live grass carp being found in 2016?
Yeah, so one action that we are planning that's well underway is to do an on-water exercise with the province of Ontario, just to better train ourselves, be better prepared for responding for any further potential live grass carp captures in Canadian waters. So what we're going to do is basically it's like role playing. We're going to be out on the water, and in one day we're going to pretend it's 3 days and challenge ourselves with different pretend scenarios and how would we react and communicate and take action based on the scenarios that are going to be given to us. So that's planned for this spring, and I think that's going to put us in a really good position for future detections.
Another question is, how many separate locations in the Sandusky River have been found to have grass carp eggs?
I would have to defer, and I don't know if University of Toledo or USGS are on the line, and I know they can't talk because they're muted, but it's been a handful of eggs in just 2 or 3 locations. So it's not like there's eggs everywhere, just a handful of them, and just in a handful of locations. I don't have the number on where exactly they were collected.
Okay, and the last question we have is, instead of using fully fertile fish, could fish be mechanically sterilized so they cannot spawn, but would likely still be exhibiting spawning behavior?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I know that when you handle fish, you're going to have mortality. I know when we did the Michigan exercise, we tried to tag fish, and both of those fish died. So these things don't handle very well. So the more you're handling them and messing with them, and I'm not even sure if there's a way you can do what's being said. Yeah, it's a complicated one. I just don't know the answer.
Okay, we have actually a couple more questions now. Have you used eDNA for monitoring in Ohio?
We have used eDNA for monitoring for bighead and silver through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There was some eDNA monitoring that was done by Central Michigan and the Michigan DNR as part of the exercise that was done in 2014. I mentioned we had some science behind the sampling locations, and that's what we used was environmental DNA to try to get us on fish. We didn't find it was very effective, obviously, because we only found 2, whereas we were getting hits for grass carp, just not finding them. But I know that the Fish and Wildlife Service is close to having all the tools they need to start monitoring for grass carp using eDNA.
Okay, another question is, what fish are known to prey on grass carp?
Well, I would say when they're small, just any fish predator is probably going to eat them. The problem is, and we found this with common carp when we tried to use a predator to control them, is these things grow so fast that they grow out of the range that they can eat. So yeah, they can eat them when they're small, but they quickly get to a size where predators are just not effective as a control measure.
Okay. We actually got a comment from someone from USGS that did a sterilization. They tried to surgically sterilize grass carp, and the gonads grew back, and they had a very good surgeon, but it grew back and there was no mortality. So I think that answers another question we had earlier.
Okay.
So yeah, that looks like about all the questions we have and also have time for today. So thanks, John. That was great, and thank you, Becky, for contributing also. To everyone listening, we'll be posting this webinar on our website at www.asiancarp.ca for anyone that missed it or if you had to leave early from the question period. And also stay tuned for some upcoming webinars in the spring. So thanks again, John, and thanks for listening, everyone.
No, really appreciate it. Thanks.